when we talk about trauma, at least in the research, we refer to an event or events that's outside the realm of typical human experience. So in order for an event to be traumatic, the person who experiences it needs to feel that their life is in harm's way. So it's a threat to life or limb, or the life or limb of someone close to you, as in, for example, a mother holding a baby, and if the mother's life is threatened, even if the baby's life isn't, or the young child's life isn't, that's pretty traumatic. Traumatic events can be man-made, or they can be natural, like fires or tornadoes or hurricanes, or motor vehicle accidents, exposure to war as a civilian or as a soldier, domestic violence, and maltreatment, abuse or neglect. And what happens with birth to 5-year-olds is that the experience of traumatic events manifests in multiple different ways. And we have a diagnosis called post-traumatic stress disorder, which captures some, but really nowhere near all of the experiences and the the symptoms of a very young child who's been exposed to domestic violence or different kinds of traumatic events.
I would say it's important to understand typical child development so you can know what is normal and then what is outside of normal. I think especially when you're working with really young children, especially the toddler age, that stage of development, expresses a lot of difficult behaviors that are actually normal. So like biting and tantrums, like that is in the realm of normal. And so when we're looking at kids, and sometimes even parents will look at kids and what looks like is not normal actually is. And so it's important to have discussions with parents and other providers about, what is and isn't normal.
One of the things that concerns a lot of people who are working with kids is to look at a child's behavior and then to extrapolate from that and say, oh, they must have been traumatized because look how they're acting out in kindergarten or in preschool. That's really problematic. But what you might say is, has something happened to this child? And then if you find out that the child has really experienced something out of the realm of normal experience, like something awful, and then you see some behaviors that are consistent with that exposure, and those could be acting out behaviors, they could be regressive behaviors like thumb sucking or soiling or wetting pants, or nightmares, or even a child who seems frozen, then those behaviors take shape and context.
So I've worked with one family on a child. They had just turned 3, and they were having just big tantrums. Like, child was inconsolable, and so it's normal for a child that age to have a tantrum and to have something feel hard. But then you would expect that they, with the right adult support, would be able to get back on track. But this child, even with the adult support, could not get back on track. And so then we're going to look to see, like, okay, how do we get them back to that point? So we'll try different things that adult can do to help that child get back on track, so that those tantrums don't keep going, that they don't keep getting out of the normal range of what we want to see with a child that age. We also work with a lot of kids, because they've experienced trauma, have a lot of language delays. When you think about a child who's experienced trauma, often there are delays in other areas of development because they can't focus on that learning and growing in all those other areas because that trauma has sort of kind of got them stuck. So we see kids that get stuck in a place or skipped over a stage of development, especially kids who've experienced big traumas at young age. They will kind of miss an area of development and kind of need to go back to it. So sometimes we have kids that come into our room and they're 3, but they are seeking out things that you would see like a 18-month-old or a 2-year-old seek out because they didn't get that during that time. So a lot of times you'll see a kid who needs to go back, and you need to rock them and soothe them in a way that you might soothe a younger kid. And so we have to keep that in mind in terms of development too. Like you might have a 3-year-old, but they're actually, in terms of development, more at 18 months or 2. And we often see when a trauma happened, if we look at what age that trauma happened, we see that they missed some development there and some skills, and we need to go back in our minds to that age and think about what did those kids miss and how do we give them that so they're not stuck. We've had kids that put a lot of things in their mouth, and that can be a sensory thing, so that can be something that's connected to a sensory issue with a kid, but it can also be evidence that when that child experienced that trauma and they were a car seat baby. So, during that time, they might have spent a good chunk of their first year in a car seat and didn't get a lot of that tactile stuff, putting stuff in their mouth and all of that. And they're going back into that phase, needing to rework it.
Early on in life, we're still developing, and so some of the skills that are still developing can be impaired. If you think about kids, certainly from birth to 2 or 3, I would argue that one of the key, and most people would agree, that one of the key tasks for a child is to develop a secure attachment relationship. And so when we think about exposure to traumatic events, we have to think about what they do to an attachment relationship. So for example, if you're abused early on in life, especially if you're abused by a parent, then what you learn is that the people who are supposed to love you and look after you can't be trusted. And so that, all other things being equal, if you didn't have exposure to a trusted, loved caregiver, you may go through life feeling that people can't really be trusted, and relationships can be confusing things. And if you don't have some help along the way from a therapist or a program, then you could go through life and you could really experience disrupted relationships, which much later on in life could mean that, for example, you become involved in an abusive relationship. And we know that people who are abused as young children are more likely to be involved either as abusers or as victims later on. Now, I want to be very careful to say there's not a one-on-one, there's no certainty. It's just what we call an increased risk for a later abusive relationship, and you can understand why.
So I think when children are struggling with trust is they haven't developed that attachment with a caregiver that then they can transfer on to other adults. And so what that often looks like is that you will have children who don't seek out adults for help. So you might have a child who's playing on the playground and they fall and hurt themselves. And I would say a child who has a healthy attachment, a healthy sense of trust would go and seek out an adult for help. But if a child has not developed that, they might just lay on the playground and just cry and not seek out support. And even if adult were to go up to them and try to pick them up and comfort, their body might be stiff or they might push away. That they just don't have that expectation that adults are going to help them. So you can see that, in that instance, I think often with kids who haven't developed a healthy sense of trust, they often sabotage relationships. So when a relationship is feeling good, maybe you guys are playing a game together and everything's going fine, but they don't trust that it's going to stay like that, and so then they might just flip the game board, and it'll seemingly come out of nowhere. They will read into actions things that aren't really there. So if they are playing in the water table and they're playing with a bucket and they put that bucket down and another child picks it up, that they're going to read into that kid took my bucket, that kid wants to take all my stuff, and they're going to read that situation in a different way than a kid has a healthy sense of trust. So we have to help them learn how to read those situations different. Sometimes we will have kids who didn't get very basic needs met, like didn't get enough, there was never enough food, and they didn't get enough food, and so they will come into our classroom, and at breakfast we have these little containers of cereal, and they'll take 5 or 6 of them because they don't trust that they're going to get enough. And we have to help those kids learn how to trust that we will make sure they get enough. So we might say to them, you can take those now, but maybe next time you'll only need to take 4, and maybe next time you'll only need to take 3. We might bring those kids into the kitchen and show them the huge stacks of cereal that we have and let them know that there's enough, and we're going to make sure you have enough. So we're going to name what they're thinking and how they're reading the situation, and then we're going to talk to them about how we're going to help them and make sure that they get what they need. So you just got to rework how they're viewing adults and people in their lives, and rework how they read the interactions going on around them so that they can feel safe and secure. And you, above all else, you need to be consistent. You need to let them know that you're going to help. You're going to make it better. It doesn't mean that I'm going to let you do whatever you want, because that feels scary and that doesn't feel good. But I'm going to help keep you safe. I'm going to help you keep you taken care of.
Probably one of the worst things a child can experience is the loss of a caregiver, a primary caregiver. Especially in child welfare settings, I think it's really important to take the perspective of a child. As adults, we look and we see potential danger and harm to a child, and we say, oh my goodness, we have to remove the child from the parent. But sometimes the child's experience can be really different. And so the removal can be as traumatizing as, if not more so, than keeping the child with the parent. And I'm not advocating, I want to be very clear, I am not advocating against removal or for family preservation. I don't sit on one side or the other. I'm simply reflecting on the fact that this is, as all child welfare workers know, this is a really complicated decision. And further, when a child between the ages, well, any child, but we're talking particularly about young children, needs to be removed from their home, children should be, where possible, it should be explained to the child what's going to happen. And the child should be permitted always to take a transitional object, something from the home, with them to comfort them, something that represents the person they love who's going to be taken away from them. And that's, I think, universally should be done.
I think one of the biggest things is really keeping in mind that every time you remove a child from a home or a setting, you are damaging that sense of trust. And so sometimes kids need to be removed from their home for safety reasons. But then when they are placed, the least number of transfers to other foster homes or other places is really going to help that child build. So if you're moving that child from place to place to place, they just can't build that sense of trust. They can't. They interpret that as nobody stays, nobody's there, and we really have to help get them into a stable place, explaining to a kid, why they're moving or who this new person is in their life and how they're going to take care of them. Sometimes we make books with kids that explain that, and we let the kids tell their story, and they get to have that book that kind of explains to them who's going to take care of you now, who's going to, we'll say, when you were a baby, you lived with mom, and mom couldn't keep you safe, and mom couldn't do the mom job, so you had to go move with and live with your foster parent. And your foster parent, she will make sure that you have all the clothes you need and all the food you need, and she will rock you when you're sad. And so we'll name the things that person can do that will help build that trusting relationship. I really wish that every kid in child protection could have a book, little kid, because they really need to know their story and they need to know what's going on in their life. And I think, when kids are in child protection, their memories get lost. Like, who holds those? So if they go back to mom, but they were in foster placement for a year, who has those memories? They lose kind of a year of their life. And so those books kind of help tell their story and help them understand that point of their life too. So I wish every child in child protection had a book. Another place where child protection workers can support kids in building trust is that reunification process with mom. Often everyone thinks about reunification as a really happy time because they're going back to mom and mom did it. But that child, a little bit of their trust with mom, or a lot of their trust with mom, actually has been broken. And so how do we support a child to go back into that and know that it's going to be rocky, and how do we support them in rebuilding that trust? So again, that's not a point where everybody leaves. That's a point where we come around and we support. And we help the parent and child kind of process those feelings about coming back together and know that child's going to push, and how do we help that parent reestablish that trust? A lot of it's that reassurance and telling kids, like, I'm going to be there for you no matter what. Even when you're mad, even when you're angry, even when you're sad, I'm going to be there. And giving support to these foster parents too. It's hard work, and it's hard to always understand that those kids' behaviors are not aimed at them, and to not take it personal. And so we have to support that relationship in any way we can, so that the foster parent can be supportive and understanding of the child, and the child can believe that person is going to be there.
When we talk about complex trauma, we refer to a child's exposure to multiple different types of traumatic events that usually are ongoing. So they're chronic rather than acute. So a motor vehicle accident is an acute event, even though, of course, its impact can be long-lasting. But being exposed to abuse and domestic violence, they're usually ongoing events. So the reason people talk about complex trauma is because people recognize, at least clinically, that kids who are exposed to multiple of these kinds of traumatic events, so interpersonal traumas, show much more difficulties in functioning than kids who are exposed to single acute traumatic events. And so there have been moves to talk about like complex trauma disorder as different from post-traumatic stress disorder, or the impact of complex trauma, because it is thought that exposure to early multiple forms of traumatic events really can shape personality in not a great way. If we think about the early example I gave of exposure to abuse fundamentally altering the way a child sees a relationship as being built on trust or not, you can begin to understand how kids exposed early on to multiple pervasive kinds of traumatic events can really have a difficult time growing up when it comes to things like relationships, achievement in school. If you think about trust is kind of a sine qua non of all the relationships we have, whether it's with friends in school, with teachers, intimate relationships, not to mention the complications when it comes to sexual abuse around intimate relationships. And we also know that kids exposed to abuse and neglect also can have cognitive impairments, difficulties managing their behavior, regulating their behavior, all kinds of things. So if you have a hard time regulating your behavior, then you're at risk for all kinds of psychiatric problems, right? Because so many of the mental health disorders have as their basis problems in regulating emotions. I think it's really important to recognize that not all children who go through a traumatic event need intervention. So it's really important not to assume that. Sometimes our best efforts to help can actually interfere with the body's natural recovery process. So I think that's really important to screen for trauma and to make sure that we don't jump in right after an event and attempt to help and mess things up. So for example, there is a good literature showing that critical incident stress debriefing is not effective and maybe actually iatrogenic for kids. So debriefing, which is something that people do right after a traumatic event. No. But it's also really important to get help to kids who are symptomatic. And for example, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is a highly effective trauma treatment that can be used for kids 3 and up, and that can really help kids process and recover from a traumatic event. For very young children, Strengthen the parent. If you can strengthen the caregiver or the parent, that's probably the kid's best chance of being helped. So we have dyadic therapies like infant parent or child parent psychotherapy for very young children. And there are also things you can do in the immediate aftermath of an event, like, for example, if you have to remove a child, where possible, explain to the child what's happening, even if you don't think the child will understand. Tell them where the parent is. Tell them if the parent's safe. Let them know that. Give them something they can take with them. If you're coming into a child's home and you're a normal adult, and especially if you're a police officer, then your hips are about eye level of a small child. And if you're wearing a gun, that's what the child sees. So even if you're not a police officer, get down on one or two knees and talk to a child eyeball to eyeball. Let them know that you care about them and that you're willing to listen. I think sometimes adults are really scared to talk to children about what happened because they think they'll re-traumatize a child. That's not true. It's okay to say, and you should say, I heard an awful thing happened. That's terrible. And let the child tell you about it. Don't stop the child telling you, because that contributes to the idea that trauma is a secret and it has to be kept inside. We talked a little bit about the trauma in the context of development, but I think at any one stage in development, you don't just have a 10-year-old, but you have a 10-year-old with a particular history. So we need to consider what that 10-year-old's developmental tasks should be. And so, for example, for a 10-year-old, that's a 5th grader who we would hopefully want to be doing well in school, having good peer relationships, not having significant behavioral or emotional problems. That's the kind of kid we would say is competent or resilient. Now, we must also, if we're thinking about the impact of trauma, a traumatic event for that 10-year-old, think about that 10-year-old's history. And so I'm going to give you an example of a child who is a Somali boy, 10 years old, and was in a bus on the 35W bridge when it collapsed, along with a lot of other kids. They were on their way to a swimming outing. And the bus, everyone who lived in Minneapolis, 10 years ago knows, it was amazing that the kids weren't seriously harmed, but it was a traumatic event in that the bridge collapsed, the school bus dropped, people thought they were going to die. And this child, we can think about this as an acute traumatic event for a 10-year-old boy. But I think we also need to bear in mind that this is a boy with a history. And in this case, it was a history of exposure to traumatic events. A boy who came with his mother from a refugee camp in Kenya. And a boy who lives with his mother, whose father is in Somalia somewhere. A boy who is the oldest of 3 children, who he cares deeply about and feels that he should care for. A boy who feels tremendously guilty that he persuaded his mother to let them go on the outing that resulted in this terrible accident. A boy who has, from when he was very young, some difficult experiences, some traumatic experiences of life in a refugee camp where he and his family, including his mother, were threatened and saw some terrible things happen as a result of war. So I think what you are seeing is that it's not sufficient to look at the traumatic event, the child's age, but also to think about culture and religion, to think about past history and history of trauma. And it's complicated. And to, where possible, where you can't get information, to learn as much as possible. And I think people understand pretty well now that in the case that I just described, you'd really want to get some help from experts in the Somali community, as well as, of course, the child's mother, and to understand a little bit. Now, that example I gave you wasn't necessarily a child welfare example, but if that child ended up in the child welfare system, there's all these layers that you would have to think about. Child welfare workers, investigators, guardians ad litem, even judges, have a really, really difficult task. This is tough work, and it's important to go into it with as much knowledge as possible. So it is really important to understand that children change across development, that one set of behaviors looks different at 1 than it does at 5, than it does at 12, and it does at 16. Anxiety, for example. At 1, you might be clinging to a caregiver. At 5, you might be sucking your thumb and have a hard time going to school. At 12, you might be worried about your homework, about getting things done. You might be biting your nails. And at 16, you might be scared. You might not want to leave home. So to go off to college or to work, for example, might have difficulties thinking about independence. And those are all manifestations of anxiety. The other thing to think about, and anxiety, related to trauma, I think it's really important for people involved in child welfare not just to pay attention, though, to kids and the impact of trauma on kids, but also to pay attention to the impact of trauma on those kids' parents. It's really important to understand that a lot of today's parents in the child welfare system have had their own. In fact, the data shows that it's probably the majority have had their own experiences of traumatic events, either now or in the past. So why is it important to pay attention to the impact of trauma, not only on kids, but on their parents? Because parents who have been traumatized, particularly those who were traumatized as kids, are going to have a hard time trusting. And it's a hard thing to entrust your child to a foster care system. Parents who have been traumatized as kids or even as an adult might have a hard time making the kind of accurate judgments that we tend to expect, or acting logically. And I can give an example. A long time ago, I went with a police officer to visit a mother whose husband had recently been jailed for domestic violence, arrested for domestic violence. She was 22 years old and she had 4 children under the age of 6, and she lived in a second floor walk-up, and there were no screens on the windows, and the windows were at like hip height. And less than hip height, I think knee height of an adult. So there were 4 kids careening around a room where essentially they could fall out of the window at any time. And of course, the reaction of the police officer and myself immediately was to run over to the windows and sort of stand against them so the kids couldn't jump out. But it became clear that the mother didn't understand the danger. And if you've been abused and exposed to terrible things as a child, then you don't really understand sometimes what's safe and what's not. And we shouldn't take it for granted that adults in the child welfare system have an understanding or have trust in the system to look after their kids' best interest, that adults who've been traumatized know what's safe and what isn't, can act in a logical manner. Sometimes we think, why didn't she show up for the court hearing? Doesn't she want her kids back? But remember that sometimes those parents have been traumatized in court, that maybe the last time they were in a courthouse was when their parent was taken from them, and the courthouse itself is a trauma trigger, or the child welfare office is a trauma trigger. And so I think understanding the impact of trauma not only on kids but on their parents can be really helpful. And there are some good resources. So the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a vast number of resources. For example, 5 fact sheets for various stakeholders in the child welfare system, including child welfare workers, attorneys, judges, guardians, and parents themselves, both foster parents and biological parents, with case examples to help people think about what is the impact of trauma on parents in the child welfare system. And those were created, they're freely downloadable. And what parents tell us and other stakeholders tell us is that this is sort of helpful information. I don't believe in irreversible damage. I think it doesn't behoove us to think about irreversible damage. Every child has a chance, and some kids have a huge whopping chance, and we owe it to them to give them the best chance they have.